By 6:01 p.m. on April 4, 1968, one of the most influential voices of the 20th century would be silenced forever. The Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, would become the site of a tragedy that altered the course of American history. A single gunshot would end a life dedicated to justice, equality, and nonviolent resistance. Within hours, cities across America would erupt in grief and rage. The civil rights movement would lose its most visible leader, and the world would be forced to confront the cost of progress. But 24 hours earlier, none of this was inevitable. At this moment, Martin Luther King Jr. was still alive, still speaking, still planning for tomorrow. He had arrived in Memphis to support a strike that many considered beneath his attention. Sanitation workers, mostly black men, were demanding dignity and fair wages. It was not the grand stage of Washington or Selma. It was a local labor dispute in a southern city. Yet King saw it as essential. He believed that economic justice and racial justice were inseparable. So he came, despite threats, despite exhaustion, despite warnings from those closest to him. He checked into room 306 at the Lorraine Motel, a modest two-story building on Mulberry Street. The motel was a familiar place. He had stayed there before. It was black-owned, affordable, and central to the black community in Memphis. From the outside, it looked unremarkable. But for King, it was more than a place to sleep. It was a hub, a meeting point, a space where strategy was debated and resolve was tested. On this day, April 3, 1968, at approximately 6 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. had roughly 24 hours left to live. This is the timeline of those final hours. This is day falling. By April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was no longer just a civil rights leader. He was a symbol, a target, a man under constant surveillance by the FBI. Director J. Edgar Hoover had labeled him the most dangerous Negro in America. Wiretaps recorded his private conversations. Agents tracked his movements. Anonymous letters arrived, urging him to take his own life. The government saw him as a threat not only because of his fight for racial equality, but because he had begun to speak against the Vietnam War and economic inequality. He was connecting struggles, building coalitions, challenging systems of power that stretched far beyond segregation. This made him dangerous. And in Memphis, that danger felt closer than ever. The city was tense. On February 1, 1968, two black sanitation workers, Eckel Cole and Robert Walker, had been crushed to death in a malfunctioning garbage truck. The city offered their families no compensation, no apology, no acknowledgement. In response, over 2,300 sanitation workers went on strike. They carried signs that read, "I am a man." It was a simple statement, a demand for dignity. But the city refused to negotiate. Police attacked peaceful marchers with clubs and tear gas. Violence erupted. King had come to Memphis once before, on March 28th, to lead a march in support of the workers. It ended in chaos. Windows were smashed. Looting broke out. Police shot and killed a 16-year-old boy named Larry Payne. King was devastated. He left the city shaken, questioning whether nonviolence could still work. But he returned. On April 3rd, he flew back to Memphis, determined to prove that peaceful protest was still possible. He did not know that his return had already been noted, recorded, anticipated. At this moment, the world knew Martin Luther King Jr. as a Nobel Peace Prize winner and a man of moral authority. What it did not know was how little time he had left. April 3rd, 1968. 10:30 a.m. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived at Memphis International Airport aboard Eastern Airlines Flight 381. The flight had been delayed. There had been a bomb threat. It was not the first. King had grown accustomed to such warnings. He did not show fear. He rarely did in public. But those close to him noticed the weight he carried, the exhaustion in his eyes, the slower pace of his walk. He was 39 years old. He looked older. A small group of supporters and organizers met him at the airport. Among them was Reverend Ralph Abernathy, his closest friend and constant companion. Also present was Reverend James Lawson, a key figure in the Memphis sanitation strike. They drove directly to the Lorraine Motel, Room 306 had been reserved for King. Room 307, directly adjacent, was for Abernathy. The rooms were simple: 2 beds, a small television, a telephone, a balcony overlooking the parking lot. From that balcony, you could see Mulberry Street, cars passing, people walking, life continuing as usual. King unpacked his suitcase. He made a few phone calls. One was to his wife, Coretta, back home in Atlanta. He told her he was tired, that the work in Memphis was harder than expected, that he would be home soon. He did not mention the bomb threat. He did not mention the growing fear among his staff that Memphis was becoming too dangerous. At 12:15 p.m., King attended a strategy meeting at the Minimum Salary Building, headquarters of the Sanitation Workers Union. The room was crowded. Organizers debated tactics. Should they march again? When? What route? King listened more than he spoke. He was focused, calm. He had done this 1,000 times before. Planning, adjusting, believing that discipline and moral clarity could change the world. By 2 p.m., he returned to the Lorraine Motel. He rested. The day felt ordinary, routine, unremarkable. There was no reason to believe it would be his last. April 3, 1968, 6:00 p.m. Martin Luther King Jr. was scheduled to speak at Mason Temple, the headquarters of the Church of God in Christ. It was a massive venue, room for thousands, but the weather was terrible. A storm had rolled into Memphis. Thunder, heavy rain, winds strong enough to rattle windows. King did not want to go. He was exhausted. His throat was sore. He told Ralph Abernathy to speak in his place. Abernathy agreed. He drove to Mason Temple while King remained at the Lorraine Motel, resting in room 306. But when Abernathy arrived, he saw something that changed his mind. Despite the storm, despite the weather, over 2,000 people had come. They filled the pews. They waited. They wanted to hear King. Abernathy called the motel. He told King he had to come. The people needed him. King hesitated. Then he agreed. By 9 p.m., he arrived at Mason Temple. The crowd erupted in applause. He walked slowly to the pulpit. He had no prepared speech, no written notes. He spoke from memory, from conviction, from exhaustion and faith. His voice was hoarse. He spoke about the struggle, about Moses, about seeing the promised land. He said he had been to the Mountaintop. He said he might not get there with them. The crowd fell silent. Some wept. Others later described the speech as prophetic, as if King knew, as if he sensed what was coming. At the time, this raised no concern. King often spoke about death. He had lived with threats for over a decade. Talking about mortality was not unusual for him. It was part of his reality. But in hindsight, it would prove haunting. By 10:30 p.m., King returned to the Lorraine Motel. He was drained. He went to bed. Outside, the storm continued. Rain battered the windows. Thunder rolled through the city. And somewhere in Memphis, a man named James Earl Ray checked into a rooming house on South Main Street. He carried a rifle. April 4, 1968, 7 a.m. Martin Luther King Jr. woke late. He had slept poorly. The storm, the exhaustion, the weight of Memphis. He ordered breakfast in his room, coffee, toast, eggs. He ate little. Ralph Abernathy joined him. They talked about the march planned for April 8th. They discussed logistics, routes, permits, the need for absolute discipline. King was determined that this march would be peaceful, that it would redeem what happened on March 28th, that it would prove nonviolence still worked. By 10 a.m., King attended another strategy session, this time at the Lorraine Motel. Organizers crowded into room 306. They debated. They argued. Some wanted to cancel the march. Others wanted to proceed immediately. King listened. He mediated. He insisted the march would happen, that it had to happen, that the sanitation workers deserved nothing less. At noon, he made phone calls, one to his brother, A.D. King, in Louisville, one to his mother in Atlanta, one to his lawyer, Chauncey Eskridge, about legal matters related to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. These were routine calls, administrative, mundane. Nothing suggested urgency. Nothing hinted at finality. By 1:30 p.m., King ate lunch, catfish, a favorite. He joked with his staff. He seemed lighter, almost relaxed. The tension of the previous days appeared to lift. At 3 p.m., a federal court hearing took place downtown. King's lawyers were arguing to allow the April 8th march to proceed. King did not attend. He remained at the motel. He trusted his legal team. He used the time to rest, to think, to prepare. At 4:00 p.m., Reverend Samuel Kiles stopped by room 306. He invited King to dinner at his home that evening. King accepted. He was looking forward to a home-cooked meal. Soul food, a break from the motel. By 5:00 p.m., King began getting ready. He shaved. He put on a fresh white shirt, a dark suit. He splashed on aftershave. He checked his appearance in the mirror. He looked tired, but he looked ready. At this point, he had less than 1 hour to live. April 4th, 1968. 5:30 p.m. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped out onto the balcony of room 306. The air was cool. The sky was clearing after the previous night's storm. Several of his aides were in the parking lot below, preparing to leave for dinner at Reverend Kiles's home. King leaned against the railing. He was in good spirits. He called down to Ben Branch, a musician and organizer. He asked him to play a specific song at the rally later that night. "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." He wanted it played beautifully. Branch nodded. He promised. At 6:00 p.m., King turned to speak with Ralph Abernathy, who was still inside the room. He told him to bring a coat. The temperature was dropping. Abernathy said he would. King stepped back toward the railing. He stood there, relaxed, unguarded, visible. Across the street, in a rooming house at 422 South Main Street, a man aimed a Remington rifle through a bathroom window. At 6:01 p.m., a single shot was fired. The bullet struck King in the right cheek. It severed his spinal cord. He collapsed instantly. Blood pooled on the balcony. His aides rushed to him. They screamed for help. They pointed toward the rooming house. Abernathy ran out. He cradled King's head. He called his name. King did not respond. An ambulance arrived at 6:05 p.m. King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital. Doctors worked desperately to save him, but the damage was catastrophic. At 7:05 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. Within hours, riots erupted in over 100 American cities. President Lyndon B. Johnson declared a national day of mourning. The world reacted with shock, grief, and rage. 2 months later, James Earl Ray was arrested in London. He pleaded guilty to the assassination. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He later recanted his confession. Questions remained. Conspiracy theories emerged. To this day, some believe Ray did not act alone. Others believe he was a pawn in a larger plot. The truth was never fully clarified. What is certain is this. On April 4th, 1968, the world lost a voice it could not afford to lose. The civil rights movement continued, but it was never the same. King's dream lived on, but the dreamer was gone. This was Day Falling. One day, everything changes.